So, boys and girls, welcome back to the channel. Unfortunately, I can't get Warhammer 3 to stream properly. If you've been trying to watch my streams on Warhammer, you can see that it's very choppy and it drops constant frames. It's a bit of a nightmare. At first, I thought it may be something to do with the bit rate, so I've changed the bit rate. Then I thought it was to do with my optimization in terms of my graphics card. Perhaps I had options or modes open that was restricting or overdoing the GPU. In the end, it turns out like the GPU is being 90% used no matter what settings are being used, and I think OBS is not able to stream the current build for Warhammer 3. At least my OBS isn't. But if you've probably got a different setup, then perhaps you could. But this means that although I'm getting silky smooth sort of running in the actual campaign when I'm playing offline and not recording, what you see and what I see are two different things. So this is going to be a Warhammer 3 review. I've got 18 hours into it so far. I've got really towards the end game of both of my factions I've played as, in terms of I've secured my positions and I'm now just finishing off the last two Blood God, two Chaos Gods. So what do I think about this game? Well, first let's do an overview. Warhammer 3 covers, if we just do a new campaign, covers mostly the Northern Realms. So it covers Kislev, Cathay, and a lot of the Chaos Wastes. Primarily, there is quite a interesting uniqueness to each faction, as you have the sort of the Russian-inspired pseudo-Polish Kislev, which has got very unique hybrid units such as the Strotsky, which can be used both in melee and as gunpowder units, and the Cossacks or the Cossars, which also have armor and can be used in melee as frontline troops, as well as having the ranged pistols. It's quite a fun nation to play, because it, for the most part, gets you somewhat in the action without being too easy or too difficult. So if you play as Tsarina Katerin, you start here. You have the enemy moving in from the north, from the Chaos Wastes and the Chaos Invasions, and then you've got the Empire to the south and the Vampire Counts to the southeast. So for the most part, this means you're pretty central. It means that you'll always be fighting whatever's coming down from the north, and for the most part, you'll be having a pretty interesting game in that regard. Equally to the west, you've got a lot of allied nations, and you've got sort of a filter to don't really advance. So I quite like Tsarina because once you've secured this bottleneck, you're pretty stable. Equally as Kostautin, I haven't played him yet, but from what I've been looking at, he starts in a much worse position because the Chaos train of doom starts coming down rapidly to slap you as soon as they get the chance, and so Constantine is not the better one. As I've mentioned, a lot of the nations have their unique mechanics, and they are quite nice and quite amusing. For example, but some of them, what the problem I have is, I'll have to make this review rather general, so I was going to go for ages. Is that some of the faction mechanics you want to avoid doing until you're set up. So, for example, if we play as Khorne, for example, he has a mechanic where if you loot and raise things, or if you raise things, you, as long as you've got one settlement in that province, you may eventually automatically colonize it without a cost. So it promotes you raiding and raising. However, if I'm playing on hard difficulty or very hard difficulty, your army is too expensive to run, and because of auto-resolve, you have to basically fight every single battle with the main character, with Scarbrand. And so you either have a choice of having this very small army, which for the first couple of turns you have to do mind-numbing manual battles using Scarbrand to win every battle, or do you occupy these settlements and completely ignore the mechanics and build up straight away? And it can be rather difficult. What I've found is that a lot of the Chaos nations up north is a bit chaotic because, well, rather amusingly, because everyone's fighting each other. There's not a lot of resources in those areas, and if you attempt to expand, then the mechanic introduced into this campaign, the Chaos Rifts, effectively hinders you and is actually to your detriment. So this means that you have a very interesting game. So what is a Chaos Rift? So effectively at random parts of the game, rifts to Chaos will open, which you can use to go through and go into the realms of Chaos. You can go to Shanisha's realm and get paid to go away, basically, and get some random boons and gifts. You can go to Khorne's realm and get some really good weapons and armor, or you can go to Zetsun's realm or Nurgle's realm, and so on, so on, so on. However, also random hordes can come out of those rifts, and because these rifts open in pretty much every single province, what will happen is you overexpand, or if you expand too much in this total war game, you actually end up gimping yourself, because you won't have enough armies, especially on the hard difficulties, to protect your empire completely, because you have to go around whack-a-moling these rifts. And if you've only got 2 armies, because of the economy system is pretty which is pretty hard for Kislev and to an extent the other Chaos factions, you quickly lose settlements and lose your inner empire, especially as the later Chaos Rift gets very, very difficult to handle. This leads to quite a unique game where you want to turtle. So if you're playing as Kislev, you don't want to keep on expanding. In fact, you want to rely more on your allies and the AI, especially or Cafe. Once you've taken the Great Wall or secured the Bastion and kept the ogres happy, you pretty much do nothing for the entire game and just sort of sit there until a rift opens. You send your main army through the rift, and then you close the other rifts. And so that can lead to very interesting games. So as Kislev, you can just hold and hope to prevent the Chaos Waves coming. As Grand Cafe, you can have a really good early to mid game, trying to keep Chaos, I'll keep the hordes out of Cafe, but once they've secured Cafe, it becomes a really boring late game. Same with Kislev. It also makes the Chaos factions rather unbearable to play on the harder difficulties, because one of the things you want to do as Chaos is you want to build up, expand, and then be able to attack the realms of man down south. You want to move down and attack the Empire and burn and pillage and destroy Kislev. But what really happens is you sort of muddle around in the north for a bit, and then a Chaos Rift opens, and you either start turtling in the north and conduct no further expansion, because you don't want your main and strongest army to start moving away, because you want to send them through the Chaos Rifts and you want them to be full strength. Or you go fuck it, go through a rift and potentially lose your empire because of the other Chaos stacks ploughing through your land. A thing you can do is, of course, you can use the rift to teleport to other parts of the map. So if I was a Khorne, I could go through into Sanusi's realm, go through another rift, and end up in the Empire, for example. But the problem with that is, because all of these factions are settlement factions, you're effectively just going to lose your main settlements doing that, especially early game when you only got 1 army. And because the campaign is so rushed, it's a race to get all the blood seals, you're wasting a turn or wasting a rift outbreak to teleport to somewhere else. And on the hard difficulties, that can make it very difficult. So what I would have recommended is if they had made the Chaos factions more like hordes. So for example, Khorne could have been a horde, which just picks up random fighters. Nurgle could be a settlement, of course, because Nurgle sort of makes sense to that effect. Shanice, yeah, I could probably get away with a settlement, but Zetz probably as well. But I probably would have said all these 3, really, if you wanted a perfect game, with the exception of perhaps Nurgle. But even then, Nurgle would have been a pretty good horde spreading disease and plague. So really, these 3 probably should have just been hordes rather than building settlements, because it just ends up being a northern waste bowl for the player, and by the time you actually achieve anything, the rifts have opened and you're forced to start turtling, which makes the game very difficult to play. So I've played Kislev, Grand Cafe. So I played Grand Cafe. Grand Cafe's fun. I played the brother, and it's good early mid game when you're trying to prevent, trying to do damage control of the Bastion. But once everything is secured and you've dealt with the rebels and the Chaos insurgents and you're strong enough, then the game becomes a bit of a ruffle stop. Same with Kislev. Again, the mistake I made was over expanding in this game. And my first game I failed on hard because I went down to beat up the vampire count. The Chaos Rifts opened, and then a death stack of Chaos came from the north, and I pretty much lost the entirety of the north because my main healthy army was too busy beating up Vlad because I was scared the Empire was going to get the good news. And of course I failed dismally as Khorne because the issue was finances. I couldn't afford to actually play the mechanics as they were intended. It meant that if I went around, I sacked and looted one area, I got a load of skulls, but the skulls were pretty pointless because I couldn't use them for anything. I couldn't use them for cheap units. I couldn't use them for anything like that. Where it made more sense to actually occupy the settlements, which then would have given me some more income so I could actually keep on fighting the war. Now, perhaps the mechanics could have been better if what was I going to say? Perhaps the mechanics could have been better. But the big problem with these mechanics is that they're add-ons. You don't actually, from my experience, you don't play the faction around those mechanics. The mechanics are something you can do after you've played normally. So, for example, you play Khorne normally, and then once you've got your main provinces, then you start going around looting and raising. But then it's counterproductive because you're sending your army out to loot and raise, but your army's away from your territory, which means that it's away from the Chaos Rifts, which means that you're vulnerable. So unless you build a second army, which you can't afford because all the units are so painfully expensive on harder difficulties, you're pretty much stuffed around turtling and occasionally going through to the chaos, to the realms of chaos. And that's what I feel is the big limitation of this game right now, is that the campaign has turned the game into a race. And although it's an interesting way of turning the game away from this constant expansion to this sort of make a middling empire, so you can feed at least 3 armies, one to go for the Chaos Rifts, one for whack-a-moling, and one for choke point holding. It makes the game very linear and one-dimensional. You can continue expanding your empire at your own detriment, or you can reach a acceptable size and then stop expanding and wait for the rifts open, which is the most optimal way of winning the campaign. In fact, I would say expansion is pretty limited. If you're on a far corner of the map and there's no need, you've got no real enemies nearby, you can just sit there and just go for the rifts and do nothing for the entire game. What the rifts would have allowed the game to be would have been great for hordes. So, for example, if you played Attila a while back, the big problem with Attila was that the Empire, the Western Roman Empire and the Eastern Roman Empire would all start chasing you across the map. Now, the rifts would have made a very interesting mechanic, meaning if you are a horde faction, you could go through a rift to escape from the chasing armies and then go for another rift to end up on a different part of the map, allowing you to go around causing more chaos. But unfortunately, this does not occur, and you end up with the potential to go to other parts of the map, which you don't really need to do, and there's no real point in doing so, because all that means if you're Cathay and you go up towards you decide to teleport over to the Empire, you end up with just expanding yourself and to your own detriment. That leads to a very one-dimensional playstyle. So what I would have recommended is the 3 factions, Khorne, all these fellows, be hordes rather than actual settlements. However, that's just my own opinion. I haven't played Yoga Kingdoms yet. I've only got 18 hours in, or the Demons of Chaos. I had Demons of Chaos even harder because you're pretty much slap bang in the middle of the order tide. So you start there and your order tide is here, and then the chaos tide is here. So you're basically stuck within a hard space. So in terms of easiness, I would say the easiest faction I've played so far was Zhao Ming, because you start in the top right corner map. So you have the Bastion, which your AI friend who loves you holds. You've got Yoga Kingdom to the south, which actually absolutely love you and will continue to love you if you keep on doing the right caravan decisions. And you've got the elves, not the elves. You've got a load of AI caffeine factions that also love you. So once you've dealt with the rebels and the first chaos invasion, you're just living in easy street. And then you can just do as you want, but then you're very limited about how you can expand, because you either expand in this hellhole, which has got low low livability, or you either start advancing against the ogres, which again is not your interest, because the campaign is the way it's designed. It's not in your interest to expand after you're middling in size. Fighting massive wars against other massive empires is no longer in your interest to play this campaign, because it just stretches your resources. So when you get to the later chaos rifts, when more chaos and stronger chaos armies come out, you're just not going to be able to survive. And so the big limitation is that this game is supposed to be total war, but it ends up being total turtle, because all you want to do is turtle up. Of course, you can say you have the option to expand, but you either have the optimum solution, which is turtling for most of the game after you've done the mid and the early game rebel squashing and minor faction squashing, or you expand excessively to your own detriment and achieve the same result as the turtling does, but with more hassle. And that's the big problem with the main campaign from now. So you can see here, Grand Bastion, she starts in the worst part. Kislev, as I've mentioned before, quite interesting setting. So she starts here. You've got the Empire to the south, and you've got that bottleneck there, and then you've got the other Kislevian factions there. So this also means that some of the mechanics in this game are counterproductive. So if you're playing hard or very hard, you have the option to get supporters in as the Kislev factions, and if you get enough supporters before your opponent does, you can forcibly confederate them. Now, this is actually counterproductive, because if you forcibly confederate your another Kislevian, your Kislevian opponent, you end up with a massive empire without the AI bonuses, meaning that you have less armies to field against the chaos waves and the rifts. And so it leads to a game where you want to have AI allies around you rather than constantly expanding, so they can spawn more troops or spawn bigger armies in you, because the AI can cheats. And so one of the main ideas behind it, behind the Kislevian faction, the idea of gaining supporters to potentially confederate the Orthodoxy or vice versa, is pretty backwards and something you don't want to do, because of how badly it gimps you in the long run. Equally, a lot of the building roster for Kislev means that you either choose between having an economy or having supporters. And so one game which I lost, which was the beating up the vampire counts game, it's because I spent all my money on buildings that gave me supporters rather than fielding armies. And so once the stacks started coming down, I was pretty much done for, because I couldn't field any further forces. And that's one of the big things, is that this entire game does not promote total war. It promotes limited war for limited territorial gain, and then doing the quests. Now, I quite enjoyed the Kislev faction. I really enjoyed the units and the playstyle. The battles are amazing. I still really like the battles. Like, if you look at a unit roster, can we look at a unit roster? It had some really interesting units. So, as I've mentioned, Kislev has got the potential for bear cav and leopards and all that wonderful stuff, but really its main units, that ability to have that gunpowder front line and that melee front line along with that Strotsky is amazing. Like, look at that. You've got a melee attack of 28 compared to the melee attack of 34 as a Tsar Guard, and that's the Strotsky. And it's got a melee attack of 32. I mean, it's got limitless armor, 65, but only a bit, so you could technically just go around with Strotsky all the time. And so it leads to quite a unique game style where you sort of do a synergy between magic to slow down the advancing waves, while you have your Strotsky just shoot everything to pieces, which I found really, really interesting. And equally, like, each faction's troops and cafes got some interesting mechanics, like that yin and yang system. So units have yin and yang, or they're yin, some are yin category and some are yang category. So, for example, most of your range will be, I believe, yang, yin, okay, and most of your entry will be yang. Now, if you've got those troops together, yin and the yang troop together, they get improved combat ability. So it means that you end up building these rather boring but basically balanced armies of melee, X amount of melee, X amount of ranged, and then keeping them together. Equally, that the faction play style of that yin and yang system means that although Cafe is one of the few factions that can make tons of money really quickly, and through its caravan system, its building is slowed by the fact that you've got to wait to build your a yin building, then you've got to wait to build a yang building, which means that you end up being a rather slow, methodical nation, but a turtly one and a very powerful one. And it's really fun, the actual the units and the graphics and the actual fighting. I would say Cafe is probably closer to the Empire build, or sort of like an Empire-like, because it's got, again, bogline infantry, some gunpowder, some rocket artillery, but for the most part, it's going to be pretty average troops. And then, of course, you've got your factions like Khorne, which is effectively just a battering ram. They're all really good at melee. They've got no range apart from one cannon. And your main character just solos armies by itself. But, as I've said, it's got the same problem as, say, the Chaos Warriors and in the first Warhammer, that on harder difficulties you just get bogged down fighting in the north, and it's not till like turn 500 that you can eventually start attacking the south, and by that time the game's already changed, or because the campaign is a race, you've already lost the campaign. And so the big problem with the northern armies of chaos is the fact that for the most part you won't be fighting you won't be fighting the Order Tide. You'll be fighting each other for the most of the game, which can be rather boring. But again, it has quite unique units and rosters, like Chaos Warriors, Bloodletters of Khorne, all that sweet stuff, and it's all pretty fun. So I don't really have an issue with the combat, because a lot of the combat has a lot of synergy, and I do think out of the 4 unit countries I played, so I played Kislev, Cafe, a bit of Khorne, and I did a bit of Slynensk, that I do enjoy the variety. There have been some complaints about there's not enough units in the roster, and I can see that, but they'll probably add more as expansions. But the big underlying red flag, if you get anything from this video, is the fact that the gameplay or the campaign is very one-dimensional. You don't have a lot of variety. Now, of course, most Total War games, you can say, well, there's not a lot of variety. You expand north, expand east, expand south. But the most optimum way of playing the game is to turtle. Get your first region, get your 2 regions, find a bottleneck, hide there. And that means there's very little replayability from the campaign's perspective. You won't be advancing over to fight the Ogre Kingdoms as Kislev. You won't be pushing all the way into the Chaos Wastes as Kislev. You won't be as Khorne moving all the way down to beat up the Vampire Council, or vice versa, because it is not in your interest to do so, and in fact it's very difficult to do with the campaign mechanics and the constant chaos rifts. And this effectively means that you will play this once or twice, or you'll play each faction for their particular region, but after that you've completed the campaign, or after a certain point, you'll stop expanding, and it means that if you want to see what the Ogre Kingdoms are doing, then you want to have to play Cafe. You can't play as Kislev and go off and fight the Ogre Kingdoms, although there's one Ogre Kingdoms faction next to you. If you want to play as Khorne, if you want to go down and beat up the Empire troops, then good luck with that. You'll be mostly fighting Nurgle, Slaanesh and Sens for most of your game, until the campaign is over. And so on and so forth. It means that you won't be doing these mass migrations east or west or south, or blobbing across the map, because you won't have enough time to do it, and quite simply put, it won't be on your interests. So, for example, I play as Cafe. I secured Cafe border. Well, when I was playing Zhao Ming, when I started moving south into the Ogre Kingdoms, all it just meant is I started getting gimped, because I started running out of choke points. I only had a certain amount of armies, because I couldn't. I had to keep one army at home just to protect my empire from chaos rifts, and so it ended up just being this slow, mind-numbing grind of just one army trying to push through here, taking territory I didn't really need for no real reason. just because of a total war game. When I could have just sat here for the next 50 or 60 turns waiting for the next rift open to carry on the game. And that is a big problem with this, is that there's no end game to speak of. There's no purpose for expansion. Now, you could say in the first Warhammer, there was a reason for expansion because you needed to get strong enough to fight the invading Chaos armies because it was the end times. And if you were too small and too weak, then the death stacks would come and wipe you out. In the second Warhammer, you had to expand to capture the areas of power, and you need to expand to be strong enough to fight back any invading forces once you did your rituals. In this game, there is no reason to expand. You do the quests. The only reason you expand is to make free armies. Once you make free armies, you're good to go. And that is the big issue with this current game, is that the battles are fun. The factions are interesting, but the campaign in itself and the rift mechanics means that you will have a one-dimensional, boring game after you've played it once or twice. So I've played Kislev 3 times, and now there's no change to what I do after the mid game. It's just repeating the same thing over and over, occasionally go to the Chaos Rifts. And that is the issue, is that there's no replayability after you've played your faction of choice. So, unfortunately, I can't show you the combat or the graphics. I won't really mention the bugs. But because it doesn't record very well, I can't really show you what I mean. Once I go to the campaign map, it'll poo its pants. But to briefly summarize the game to you, I would get it for Mortal Empires only. Right now, base game, I'd get it for Mortal Empires only. The campaign in itself is boring after a certain point. Fun, I played 18 hours on it. It'll be fun for a while. But after your like 5th or 6th playthrough, you'll be rolling your eyes because they all play the same. Every game, the strategy for every nation is the same, which is expand enough to turtle, build your free armies, one for chaos, one for the quests, one for the choke point, one for chaos rift whack-a-moling, do nothing for the rest of the game. And I'm not sure yet how the AI is able, large AI empires are even able to sort of stop the chaos rifts, because they're probably having the same issues I was having. But I assume on legendary mode and things like that, it's not going to be that much of a problem. In short, it'll be a lovely expansion for the Mortal Empires game, or for the Mortal Empires expansion, or for the final combination of all 3 nations. But for now, the multiplayer, the campaign is rather uninspired and will get repetitive after your 5th or 6th playthrough. Until other DLC factions come out with potentially different campaign objectives, or they add a couple more hordes or play around with different things, maybe add more units or add more factions with more interesting mechanics. It'll be a strong pass from me. I mean, I've enjoyed playing it. I'll enjoy playing it over and over again, but it doesn't do Warhammer 2. It doesn't build off Warhammer 2. It's not as if you're a Warhammer fan, then sure, it's great, wonderful, go ahead. If you're just there for the battles and that, sure, fine, go ahead. But if you want an intelligent campaign, then you're gonna have a bad time. You're gonna have a real bad and uninteresting time. After you've done the quest once or twice. But again, it almost plays out like a single player game or a story based campaign with very little variables, because you just go into the Chaos Waste, do the missions, come out, and rinse and repeat 5 fucking times. 4 fucking times. But yeah, that's what I would say. If you're a Warhammer fan, sure, why not? If you're going, wait for Mortal Empires if you want a more finished or a more sandboxy game. Not finished is the wrong word. If you want a more sandboxy game, if you want a sandboxy sort of classic Total War game, which has a variety of things you can do and options like Warhammer 2, Warhammer 3 or Mortal Empires, then I'd pass. However, I suspect most of you will be getting Warhammer 3 just for the Mortal Empires game. So anyway, in terms of as an expansion for Mortal Empires, it's a solid 8, I say 8. But as a standalone game, with a standalone campaign, if I imagined that Mortal Empires was not it wasn't a thing, then it would, and I wasn't an avid Warhammer fan, which I'm not. I do enjoy the Warhammer lore, but I'm not Warhammer crazy. Then I would say it is about a 7. I'd say about a 7. Which is a shame, because I'd give it in terms of the battles and that. But even then, the battles have been sometimes a bit too fast. But I think it depends on the faction you play as. But yeah, I'd give it a 7. 7 out of 10 if Mortal Empires didn't exist. And my recommendation is wait for Mortal Empires, or wait for more factions if you're just in it for the main campaign and you have no intention of playing Mortal Empires. Anyway, I'm going to end it here, boys. Sorry I couldn't show you the actual gameplay or the game to prove some competence to you. I like to before I make an opinion, I like to show people how I play the game, see what I'm good at and things like that, and so people can make an opinion about my opinion based on my own ability in the game. For example, I could be absolutely garbage at Warhammer. I could be absolutely garbage at Total War, but because I haven't shown you my gameplay, you cannot make that assessment, and that's which is unfortunate. So you'll probably have to take this into account, and then go on, look at other things, or look at my other games and see if I know what I'm talking about, and ask around. But hey, that was the best I could do with this. I'm a bit irritated that I couldn't record this properly, and I'm hoping they optimize it, because right now I'm a bit peeved, because I would have loved to show you some of the gameplay and show you some of the mechanics. But in any case, that's it for today, boys, and I will see you all later. Adieu.